morning we're going to talk about beautifying your custom modules and themes. Thank you for coming. I'm Will Hartman, aka Papa Grande, and my whole ecosystem. And I want to thank all our sponsors. I actually want to go out of my way and thank all of our volunteers. This conference did not happen by itself. There's a lot of people who put a lot of time in. So go out of your way and thank those volunteers, please. Quick intro to me. I'm an independent IT consultant here in Seattle. I've been working with Drupal since 2006, which is very long. Been working with computers way longer. And I've worked with a variety of clients, whether it's universities, nonprofits, B2B companies, B2C, so a whole variety of things. And I've worked with a whole variety of teams, whether it's me doing whatever's needed, working as part of a much larger team, whether locally or remote, and also as a sort of adjunct to other teams, whether I'm acting as a mentor, a PR reviewer, things like that, so a variety of roles. Which means to say that I have to be flexible to do whatever the client needs and work with a variety of teams. So that's just a little about me. And let's keep this interesting. Interrupt me with any time. If I'm going fast, just raise your hand and ask whatever question you want. I'm probably going to go zip through a bunch of technical stuff, but don't get too worried about being in the weeds. The slides will be up later, so don't worry about having to copy down anything like that. So why beautify your custom modules? So one of the things I talked about is how long I've been doing this, and I've screwed up a lot. I've made so many mistakes. I've broken a lot of things. I've blown up servers. I've done everything, and I have the scars to show for it, both literally and figuratively. And so I like having a safety net underneath me to help save me from myself. And so you might find yourself in situations where you're no longer the only maintainer of your module or theme. You start need to work with a larger team, so you need to up your game a little bit. Or your code is being used across multiple sites, say, or universities. You're starting to put it out to federated sites, things like that. And because these are custom modules and themes, they're by definition not open source, meaning you're not getting the benefit of the open source community, like thousands of eyes looking at your problems, helping out, writing tests, testing, doing edge case, things like that. So again, you're not benefiting from the beauty that is the open source community. One of the things I like to do with any team I work with is using a container or cloud-based development environment so that you're mimicking your server environment as much as possible. So the days of using WAMP and MAMP and all that stuff where you get what you get no longer cuts it, because you need to be using the same version of the database, the same version of PHP, Nginx versus Apache, things like that, so that if you're debugging, you are doing what the production server is doing. And the rest of your team is on the same environment. So you're not having to go debug like something crazy over here, that environment, or this one over here. So you're trying to make sure that you can eliminate those class of problems. I'm an advocate of DDEV. I think it's a great system, and it continues to get a lot of momentum in the community. So I'm just a big fan of that one, although I went to that Drupal Forge talk, and that was really interesting as well. So there's all kinds of things out there. There's linters, there's sniffers, there's validators, dependency checkers. There's a whole lots of things out there. So today, don't focus on the individual tools. Just think about the concepts of how to work this into your development workflow, into your team. So let's first talk about package management. So if you've ever used Drupal 8+, you know about Composer. And so it's something to use. And so think about incorporating the Composer validate command into your workflow. And that all it does is check to make sure that your lock file is correct. And so do it early before it gets up to the server. Composer audit is another one. It checks for security issues. You can roll that into your workflow. And then this particular package, the Composer lock diff package, allows you to, it shows you all the diffs in your lock file, what's in Git, and then you can just copy and paste those right into your commit messages, and it makes it very pretty. It's nice. Is there a question over there? I saw a face go. Huh? Okay. Same with node package management. I'm not an expert in this stuff, but NPM audit, you can find security issues, things like that. There's plenty of tools out there you can use as well. So, and if you're doing a lot of node-heavy development, incorporate those into your development environment. So let's move on to linting and sniffing of your PHP code. Because you're not getting the benefits of open source, it's nice to have these tools to look at it for you. So there's a tool called PHP CS, PHP Code Sniffer. And then if you add the fix thing, or BF, you can turn it into Beautify. It comes with Drupal core dev, so if you're installing that package, you get it for free. And you can just run that command against your custom code and modules. And then this package, by the way, allows you to install additional standards out there, not just the standard ones that Drupal uses, Drupal and Drupal practice, which I'll get to in a second. So the main one, Code Sniffer. It's got a configuration file, which I'll show you in a second. And then you just run the command based on that config file of what it should sniff. So if we go and look at, is that legible? You can tell it, which files do you want it to sniff. So I want to do my custom modules. I want to do my custom theme. I want to do this PHP file, which I'll talk about in a second. You can also exclude things you don't want to look at. So you don't want to look at the vendor files, because that's all somebody else's problem. Node modules, pattern lab, things like that. Any components that you might be getting from third party. Because, again, you're pulling those from somewhere else. You don't need to sniff those as part of your custom module. You can tell it what extensions to sniff, which config is. Oh, this is wrong. It's saying 7. Although I found this doesn't really do anything. So anyway, that should be 10. And then what rules you want to be using. In this case, we're using Drupal and Drupal practice, the standard ones that Drupal uses. And so if I go back to the slide and I run this command, oops, the PHP CS command, it'll use that config file and run it against those directories that you've told it to do. One of the nice things about that exclude attribute is that you can exclude modules that maybe have a whole lot of errors in them right now. And so over time, you can get rid of those errors, particularly if you're inheriting projects from somebody else who just didn't use the same tool. And you can also override rules in those config files. And so if there's a particular rule that keeps getting flagged saying, oh, you're violating this, and you're like, I am knowingly going to violate this rule, then you can put that in there and say, stop bugging me about that one. When I talked earlier about these other packages you can install, some of the other ones are PHP Compatibility. So say you're on PHP 8.1 now, but you want to start testing for 8.2, 8.3, 8.4 coming up. Make sure you don't have any code in there that's going to have a gotcha as soon as you upgrade. You could put this in there and start testing for the future. And so it's similar to what Drupal core is doing on Gitlab, where they're starting to test future versions of Drupal core, things like that. So it's starting, not completely future-proofing, but you're getting ready for what's coming up. And what was I going to show on this one? Is the config file is, again, you're just doing the same sort of which files you want to do. And then the rule set is this PHP compatibility one. And I'm saying which version I want to do, and I want to do anything 8.0 and above. Am I going too fast? Too slow? Okay.
Are these files in the document root then, or in the site root?
The code root. But you can specify where they are, actually. And so, in fact, actually, this one here, I'm saying which standard to use, and you can just point this at anything. That happens to be the root. I tend to put all the standards, or the config files, in the root, because then I know where they all are, and I don't have to go hunting them down. The one exception to that are custom themes, because then I tend to inherit a lot of those, and I can all hunt those down too. So this one, the Slevomet, I don't know how you say that, coding standard, is this one I've added because you can turn on stricter checking of some of the logical checks. And so, I'm trying to remember, is array or is that one of them? You can put in true at the end of it. It makes it much stricter type checking. And so if you turn this on, it'll catch those errors. And that's true for, again, trying to find some of these edge cases where you might be putting code through a check function, and with things that are mistyped, it can slip through. So it's a potential security vulnerability if you've got some of these things in there. So this is a situation where you can add additional checks into your workflow to make sure you're not doing some of those things.
Does this stuff run every time you save a file? Like you would have it like a watcher?
I'm getting to that. Another one is static analysis. If you've heard the name Matt Glayman in the community, he's done a lot with this, where static analysis, you're analyzing your PHP code, not in a runtime environment, but just looking at it and making sure that the flow of logic is correct. I don't completely understand the science behind it, but it catches a lot of things. And one of the nice things about it is that you can set different levels of where you're at. So I think it's 1 through 9, and they say you usually should be at 2 at a minimum. And then I think I've gotten a lot of clients up to 5 or so. If you go to 9, you're doing like ultra strict type checking. Like Drupal core is far from 9. I think Drupal core is like a 2 or 3, if that now. But it's something where over time you can increase your levels and get better and better and tighter code that's not going to have any type check problems, and you get the benefits of all this. And because this is all coming out of every time there's an update to PHP Stan and Drupal Stan, you get these new rules added. And so one of the nice things about this is that this can check for issues with future versions of Drupal. And so if there's deprecated code in your custom module or theme, this can pick it up a lot of times. So that's really nice for future proofing. And let me show you that config file. And so here you can set the levels, whatever you want. You tell it which paths you want. And things I want to exclude. Again, I don't want to do node modules. And if there's any errors that I wanted to ignore and saying like, I'm not ready to fix those right now, you can throw those in there as well. And then I did a quick search of like PHP tools, and like I copy pasted a bunch of these. I've never used them. But my point is that there's like a gajillion of these things out there. So you can build these into your workflow of getting your code to be better and sort of more standardized to the PHP communities that are out there. So you just need to work those things in. One that's relatively new is Twig Sniffing. And this package allows you to start doing it. So things find indentation issues, which I see a lot of. Inappropriate use of extending and including things like that, and whether using single quotes versus double quotes and things like that. And you can add the fix flag, and it'll fix these things for you. So, and this core issue is for this to be added to Drupal core. So, going forward, all Drupal core modules or templates, are going to get sniffed using this particular tool. And there were some issues with version 2. Now that we're on version 3 of this, it works just fine. And it's been really helpful and helped clean up a lot of templates, a couple of projects for me. And then there's CSS sniffing. Similarly, you use a tool called StyleLint. It's got the StyleLint rc.json file for configuration, and then you can run it. The one that's slightly different about this one is that I tend to have, and there's probably a better way to do this, but I tend to put wherever the custom theme is and say run it that particular one using those styles. And yeah, cleans up your CSS and makes sure you're following all the various rules that Drupal core ones. And again, if you want to be more or less strict, you can add and subtract rules from your style into RC file. And JavaScript linting. I'm not as good at JavaScript as other things, but this helps me a lot. Things like, oh, it's supposed to be an anonymous function. It's supposed to use double quotes instead of single quotes. All the other things that JavaScript makes you do that I don't remember off the top of my head. And again, there's always a fix command for these things, and so it can help you find a lot of these issues. And it's also very handy if you're using like ChatGPT to help you write your code, which I'm guilty of. You never know what you're going to get out of those tools. So run them through the linters. It'll clean that stuff up just nicely. All right, so now let's talk about how you want to use these things. How do you want to get them into your development workflow? To your earlier question, yes, you could do it on every file saving change. That to me feels a bit onerous, only because I'm not that smart and always have work in progress. But I suppose you could do that. What I've done is a couple things. I've put them into DDEV commands, so I can do DDEV sniff CSS, and I'll show that in a second. I also have equivalent fix commands for a lot of these things. And then I've got some of these as pre-commit Git hooks. And this is something that I've added to a lot of the teams I work with, and so that when they fire up DDEV, it adds this pre-commit hook. And so every time they want to commit something to the repo, it will run these tests and say, looks good, put it in. Or, hold on, you're doing something there that, let's check that out. So do some testing on that. Run those linters or sniffers yourself and make sure that the code is good. And then a little bit of belt and suspenders, I do it again on GitHub in most cases, or on your cloud code repository. So whether it's GitHub, Gitlab, or Bitbucket, you can add a lot of these things into tools as part of your continuous integration workflow. And so it'll run these things against your pull requests, your merge requests. And if you want to do it, you could even put them in front of, before it gets your dev server, before your test server, and even your production server, depending on how detailed you want to get about these things. You can build all these things there. So these are the local DDEV commands that I've created. And so I've got a whole list of sniff commands that I can just run. So DDEV PHP CS, I run it. It sniffs all my code. And then I've got equivalent fix commands for a lot of these things where it'll just fix it for me. It's usually just adding the fix flag into that same command. And there's just, I don't have to remember that long strings I was showing you earlier and copy paste it every time, blah, blah, blah. I just run this. And then I've got one command called DDEV test, and it runs all of these. And so I can just quickly sniff everything and know it's good. So I can actually show you that. I wanted to actually show that. So I just fired up this instance of DDEV, and it shows it had copied in the pre-commit hook. And I did that as part of a DDEV config command. So when it starts up, it just runs that thing. So if I run, it just cycles through all of these and checks these things. And good, we're all fine. So simple as that. Now, if I was actually developing code, you'd find a gajillion errors because I screw up all the time. Questions? Anything? No?
Well, one of the things, what sort of recommendations do you have around doing those sorts of checks only on the files that change?
So I have had a long-standing to do it only on files that have what is it, the git blanking on it right now, but any files that are like in staging or not quite staging. And yeah, there's a way to do it. I just haven't gotten around to it. Yeah.
When you mentioned that you have these DDEV commands, are they like in your .profile.bashrc?
I can show you a few of those. So, what did I put up? So this is in your ddev commands web directory. And as soon as you give it a name and put whatever in there, it's just bash, it shows up as a command. It's as simple as that. And so that's the sniff one. There's the Beautify one. Actually, a better example would be, I'm sniffing CSS. In this case, in a lot of cases I did them as script files, and so I have them in another directory. And the reason I did that is that so then on GitHub I can just call the script files and do the exact same thing, and so that I know that I'm running the same tests in both environments, and so I don't get these weird issues like, the levels are different or things like that. I have actually run into issues where if you use GitHub action plugins built by other people using what they've implemented, whether it's Drupal core standards, things like that, you can get some weirdness depending on which PHP version they're using or which standard they're using, and so just to kind of watch out for those gotchas a little bit. But there's the actual script file. So I'm just saying the directory, do this, what syntax I want to use, and that's it. So it's basically that thing that I had on the slide earlier. It's just this in the script file. That's all it is. To answer your question? Did that answer it?
Yeah.
Good. So this is just the git pre-commit hook. So in your ddev config file, you can add this hook. So after starting, copying in that script, and that's all it is I'm pulling it out of the script directory, putting it into my git hooks pre-commit file, and then just setting the correct flags on it. And I already showed you that, so I don't need to do that again. Oops. So, testing. I'm not going to get into this much, but if you've followed Drupal core or contrib modules a lot, there's a lot of tests out there, and so there's all these different levels of unit, kernel, functional JavaScript, yada, yada, yada. You can go to that URL to see all the different types and how they explain them. Most contrib modules, or at least the good ones, do have tests in them. For your custom modules, I would say consider writing those too. If it's going to be used on a lot of sites, whether at a university or something like that, consider writing different levels of tests. And then you can just run those tests as part of either your Git pre-commit hooks or up on the server on GitHub, wherever you want. And you can run those full suite of tests. And it's pretty easy to set up. I will admit I have not written a lot of these things for custom modules because, I don't know, they're usually not that complicated, and I'm not very good at it, so I just haven't done much of it. And I already talked about this a little bit, but as part of CI, you can add these to your GitHub actions and like that. And I wanted to show you this PR. And this is actually a client. But you can see that it runs all these tests: Composer Validate, PHP Code Sniffer, front-end linting, that's JavaScript and CSS, the other PHP tests, and static analysis. And it runs all these things. And if any of these things fail, then the PR will get blocked. And so it can't be merged. And so we just set that up as part of our team and the rules for our PRs that we're not going to let these things through unless everything is green. Now, one of the things interesting on this particular client is there's another person on the team who has gone out of her way to write custom GitHub actions that tie into an external testing tool and make sure that those are all green as well. So I'm going to talk about Ghost Inspector in a second, but she has done a great job of using their API to make sure that the tests are all passing. For other clients, I do it manually, but this is pretty slick of how she's tied this all together. actually my next slide, Ghost Inspector. So functional testing, that's making sure whatever you wrote works and is still working. If you've got the benefit of a QA person, and I will say that if you find good QA people, they're worth their weight in gold. There's a certain combination of being methodical and devious at the same time that you don't find in a lot of people, I find. So hold on to those people if you find them. But in the absence of having a whole bunch of QA people, you can use automated tests. And so whether you use something like Nightwatch or Selenium or paid services, there's a lot of tools out there, and most of these have APIs that you can tap into to see the results of these tests and things like that. I like Ghost Inspector in particular. I do not get compensated by them for promoting them. I wish I would. But they used to be local. I think they got bought out. But they just have a nice little UI on top of tests. And they have a couple browser extensions so it can record all your actions and just create tests. And so you can install these browser extensions on other people in your team, non-technical people, and say, hey, go test this thing for me, and it will record all our actions, and then you now have that saved and can then rerun that thing 5,000 times, and I don't have to bother with them again. And over time, you can build up suites of tests to handle your mainstream cases, your edge cases, make sure it still works in Brazil, make sure it works in other languages, make sure it works at 3 in the morning. Whatever it might be, you can configure these tests to do all sorts of stuff. And so I'm a big fan of not letting perfection get in the way of the good or the good enough. You'll never have 100% test coverage. That's just not theoretically possible. But just over time, you will build up suites of these tests. And so for one client, I think I'm over 300 or 400 tests now in various suites, just because over time we have accumulated these things for new functionality, for edge cases. As I said, different tests from different parts of the world, because they are a global company. I have a suite that runs after deployments to warm up the caches. I've got tests that run, smoke tests that run once a day to check for critical functionality that the president or the VP is going to yell at us for. It's sort of making sure their pet project is working. Things like that. And so, and also another one is, and I can show you this, it's probably better to do that, is so I have regression test suites. This one doesn't have it, but I also have visual regression test suites where I'm not doing functional tests, I'm just doing screenshot comparisons, and this tool does it very nicely, where if I'm doing any sort of custom theme change, I just want to make sure that the thing I fixed over here doesn't break the thing over there, but it runs against 200 pages, and I really don't want to test 200 pages manually, and I just run this thing really fast, and it's great. So my workflow is I run it against the production server, that's my baseline, then I run against the dev server, see if there's any deltas. If there are, I either knowingly made a change or, oops, I did something wrong. So I got to go fix that.
Yeah, seems those would also be good for just module updates.
Oh, totally. I do it every time.
Yeah.
So I have hooks for both Acquia and Pantheon, think about it, where this will just kick off on every PR that's created. And it'll roll against either multi-dev on Pantheon or other servers, Cloud Next servers on Acquia. And yeah, it catches a lot of these things. And I'm actually dealing with a core update problem on one of the sites where I cannot get to 10.3 for whatever reason. Well, I know the problem, I don't know what the solution is yet. But it found these things for me. And in my local testing, because when I'm doing my local development, I do not aggregate CSS and JavaScript because I want to be able to see what's going on. But when it hit the server, all the tests started failing. And so that was my heads up to go like, oops, something's not quite right. And so it's great. It's another thing where it saved me from screwing up again. So it's nice.
Question. When
Yeah.
you said this tool for the screenshot comparisons, was that Kraken? Is that the tool?
It's Ghost Inspector.
Ghost Inspector.
So let me find, I'm just going to pick a random test. Let's look at a failing one, actually. It's a bit more interesting. So it's got this comparison feature, and notice that it's got a 28.7% change, and I'm saying up to 10% can change, whether it's an image change or things like that. And I can compare to see. I'm like, okay, the image shimmied, that happens a lot. I don't quite understand why, but oh, something changed here. They're not lining up the same way, which means everything below is going to be different. And maybe like, oh yeah, I wanted to make that change. Somebody wanted more spacing over there, so I know this is going to fail. And then I can just say, okay, accept. This is the new baseline. Or, I wasn't expecting that. I got to go back and say, like, why? You can change, your tolerances either at the suite level, and at the test level. So there's some tests I might want a little more strict, like my visual regression tests. I drop those down to 6%. My regular tests are usually at 10, but then there's others like, particularly in mobile, it does weird things, and so I often increase those tolerances. And then on the functionally side, this is where you can have all sorts of steps, and it can do things like go open this page, click on this link, mouse over this, enter these things into fields. You can do whatever you want. It'll record all your actions, and then you can go in and make tweaks here and there. One of the other things, if you ever get to like really crazy situations, like you need to make sure something lines up vertically, like how would you do that with just clicking around? But you can with JavaScript. You can say, measure the left location of this one, measure the location of this one, and return that equals that. And that's your test. And so, as complicated as JavaScript as you want to make it, you can drop those things into these tests and do whatever you want. And as I said, I've got these smoke tests that I like to run every day. You can schedule these things, so this is running daily. I've created admin tests, so I'm testing admin functionality for our content editors to make sure they can continue to do certain things. And that's actually, we were talking about module updates earlier, that's where a lot of these things can break. It's like, oh, layout builder XYZ module did this, or something like I can add these things to tests. I will say I had to jump through a bit of hoops to make this secure, because anytime you're doing a login, you got to make sure you're doing that securely. And so what I do is I run a script on the server that says, create a user, give them the admin privileges, and then go run the suite of tests using that user and this login, this password, which I just created. Finish the suite, and then destroy that user. And so that password, which is always a 24-character hashy thing, only lasts for minutes. And so there isn't a security vulnerability for long while that user is out there. And I'm not copying and pasting in some password in there that's shared in the whole like that. It's always unique every single time. And then once I'm in those tests, using like the masquerade module, I can go to different roles and say, in this case, I want to be the editor. In this case, I want to be the reviewer, whatever it is. You can, using masquerade, test different roles, make sure functionality is still working. Any other questions about Ghost Inspector or similar tests? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about the regression tests and how you're choosing that tolerance percentage. Is it just kind of like a best practice, or?
I think the default is 10, if I recall.
Okay.
And as I said, I dial it down for my visual regression tests down to 6.
Yeah.
But I crank it up higher for other ones. As I said, mobile, I tend to get a lot of weirdness. It bugs me that I can't, and I've talked to these guys, it's like, why aren't your mobile tests more consistent? You can choose Chrome versus Firefox, and so one browser, I tend to default to Chrome just because of market share, but I do Firefox just because they're kind of a wild card. Occasionally I've seen Safari issues, but I have to do those manually. And I guess just over time develop intuition of
Right.
where to do these sorts of things. And like anything, I guess I've built up a whole bunch of sort of best practices of how to work with this particular tool, do different things, and I've kind of got a library now of like JavaScript routines that do various things. And yeah. Oh, and the other nice thing about this tool is that you can create kind of subroutines. So, for example, logging in is a subroutine, or filling out a form is a subroutine. So I can put in things like first name, last name, company, blah, 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 blah. And I can make some of those optional. And so if there doesn't happen to be a zip code on a particular form, it'll try to put it in, but skip it if it fails. And that's nice because depending on the client, we have different fake names we use for our filling in forms. And then they have like daily routines that'll scrub out that test data. And so, we use like Wayne Enterprises, Batman's company, is the one we use. And it's like, Wayne, I'm just coming there, do that. Another example was, I think we were using, I think it was Iran, some country that we're not allowed to sell stuff to. We did that, and then suddenly like, oh, actually, we're going to start selling them things to them. Like, oh, we got to change all our tests. But I only had to change it in one place, so it's kind of nice. And so, yeah, any sort of thing that you're going to do over and over again, you can create these things, and then in a test, you can just import that into that and say, I want to use this subroutine. And actually, in some cases, it's like I have a regression test in this regression test suite, and it runs every time I create a PR. But then I discover, well, actually, I want to run that every day. And so I just go into my smoke test suite, create a new one, and then import all the steps from this other test over here, and just run that every day. And so whenever I want to update that test, I only have to update it in one place, and then it goes out to all the other things. And so I found that super handy, and not having to maintain these things like it. Because one thing I found also is that when something fails, I prefer it to fail once and not across 15 tests, because that's annoying to have to go into like 15 tests and go, yes, accept, or like that, or like. And so as I create these tests, I try to reduce any redundancy, and so that I want things to fail. I want it to fail, but I want it to fail once and not have to maintain like 15 versions of the same thing. And so one example of that is often I will create a test routine for a desktop version of a page. It's like, click this, fill in that, do this. And then I have a mobile version, which is smaller, but all I want to do is basically check it visually. I'm not doing the same functional tests again, because that would be redundant. But it might be the case, like, actually, I need to touch click some of these things to make sure it really does work on mobile. And that makes it unique or different from the previous test. Any other questions? I guess that's it. So I'll put these slides up so you don't have to cover any of these things. The only thing you need to look at, that's me. That's my D.O page if you want to contact me. Yeah, any other questions? It can't have been that good. Come on.
All right, I'll ask mine. I noticed Prettier wasn't in your list of sort of recommended tools, and I know that's a very common, tester for.
Doesn't that come under Stylint or JSLint? ESLint, excuse me.
So Prettier would just be for style.
Oh, for CSS.
Consistency. For I tend to use it for YAML or JSON, HTML if they're sort of standalone HTML files.
Okay.
I think there's a plugin for it for Twig, but you've got that other one that you mentioned that you could use instead.
Thanks. I'll have to add that one to the suite. I know with JavaScript we're using some of the Prettier tools. I'm not an expert in that stuff, but yeah. Like I said, there's a gajillion tools out there. You can just sort of slot these things in and sort of decide which ones you want and which ones you don't. And I don't know how much redundancy there is between them, but they tend to run so fast that I'm like, I don't know, can't hurt.
There's another one called Grump PHP, which other people have started using, and I haven't tried it yet, but that's.
I've seen some chattering about that, and yeah, there always seems to be something new, or yeah. And I know like with PHP Stan, that is constantly changing because it's just getting a lot of traction, both at the PHP Stan level, but also at the Drupal Stan level. There's just more stuff being added, and they're talking about actually making it a requirement that every time a change record is created for Drupal core, they also have to create a PHP Stan rule to catch that going forward for all deprecations. So that's kind of cool. So you're just going to get those every time you do a composer update or yeah, composer update or wherever the other one is. You'll just get all those rules. So, yeah.
So have you hooked any of this into an IDE for VS Code or PHP Storm to run automatically?
I have not. I'm sure you can. Yeah.
I think the plugins in like VS Code will highlight your code based on the rule set.
I've had auto-correcting for JavaScript, but I haven't figured out PHP and any of the Drupal style stuff. So.
There should be a way. It can't be that hard. I mean, you're smarter than me. I guess it is hard. So
It is possible to do. You have to, and you'd have to have PHP, unless you're doing it. So Mike and Ella did a session on another camp about how to get all this working inside of a DDEV container. And the benefit of that is you've been using the same version of PHP for everything. You're not having to try to maintain PHP on the host in addition to inside. Because if you're going to integrate it with your IDE, you've got to find some way to, you've got to use some version of PHP.
that's true. Yeah.
That's my issue, getting it to run inside the container.
I mean, would something like Drupal Forge then work for that, where you just do it all in the cloud and just set it?
Might be a solution.
Yeah, because I think there's now things where you can run DDEV in the cloud to do different things, and so sort of DDEV everywhere type thing. And I just happen to like DDEV. I mean, there's other container vendors out there, so yeah.
Well, it's funny, I mentioned prettier, but I can see it in the lower right there. It says that it's.
I guess I am using it. Yeah, I don't know, just like look at these lists of sort of things you should install, and I just like throw them in there. It's funny, like for VS Code, it started, the spell checker suddenly started working. I'm like, wait, what? And I was like, oh, I guess I was misspelling them for all these problems. Or I have to add things to the ignore list because whether it's proprietary or unique to this company or whatever it is. So, I mean, spell checks is another test you could add to your suite if you really wanted to. You know, whatever's important to your team or your client. Any other questions? Thanks.